Thank you so much to Attila and to Mikhael for joining us today. He landed 4 hours ago from Israel, so forgive him if he's a little bit, just landed from a plane. But it should be fine. So you've just heard all about Mikhael's amazing career, and he's also written this incredible book that we're going to talk about today, which is called End of Days: Ethics, Tradition and Power in Israel. It came out in English last year and in Hebrew 3 years ago, and he didn't really want it to be translated, but somebody twisted his arm. So luckily we can all understand it and talk about it tonight. We're going to start with a conversation here on stage, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience, so please save your questions up for Mikhael. We're going to start, first of all, by, Mikhael, your book it's beautiful, it's highly unusual, it's hard to explain what it is. It's a memoir, it's a work of religious and moral philosophy, it's about Jewish ethics, it's also an act of Jewish ethics in a way. In the last chapter, we can talk about that maybe a bit later. But before we discuss it, I want to ask you to read from it to give everybody here a real sense of the book itself. I'm going to pass you this heavily annotated copy, slightly embarrassing. If you go to page 12 for the letter from that your grandfather wrote on his way to Israel in 1949.
Sure. So, apart from... Hi, everybody. And thanks for having me here. I don't feel self-conscious at all as an Israeli reading something in English to you. Maybe I'll just give a bit of background. In this book, there's one letter which is sort of spread across the book, which my grandfather wrote when he arrived to Israel. So he wrote it in Yiddish. My wife is a Yiddish scholar, so she translated it for us. And this is what he wrote when he's on the ship, looking over the Carmel Mountains. He arrived in Haifa after spending 3 years in a DP camp where my mother was born. Okay, so he's writing to his friend Simcha. The ship slowly glides across the water's surface towards the land of Israel. Everything is too slow. It becomes clear that the captain is delaying bringing the ship, which carries around 1,700 Jews, into port until daylight. Here the sun starts to rise, and there was light. Before our eyes, the hope of 72 generations reveal itself in all of its glory, the mountains of Zion. I stand as if bound to the ship's railing as it approaches a port. The tension peaks. The eyes, the heart, one's entire essence is bound up in this great revelation. My whole being is shaking. My heart is beating quickly. I stare at the great naked hills in front of us. They are the first to welcome us. Miraculously, I see an old gray man with a long cane, walking with his elderly wife. They stroll at the top of the hill, talking with each other about a worldly matter. Who could it possibly be? I look carefully. Oi, it's our old grandfather Abraham with Sarah. They are walking to Gerar, the home of Avimelech, king of the Philistines. Abraham asks his wife Sarah, "Please say that you are my sister, so that it will go well for me because of you, and that I will live because of you." The story of the Torah took place on the land which my eyes see. I strain my eyes and see a second image, even more extraordinary, a small group of children leading flocks of sheep and goats, streaked, speckled, and mottled. A great herd led by slaves and maidservants, our ancient father leading them. I push myself hard against the railing of the ship to see. Should I continue?
I think that's okay.
Okay. No, it's okay.
But now I'm going to ask you to complete the picture of the book by reading a section that's not written by your grandfather. But
Sure.
by you. And this section is called How to Be a Jew in the State of Israel.
Okay.
Read that section.
Sure.
Thank you.
No, it's okay. The power presents ethical challenges. A person with power is liable to exploit power for wrongdoing, pay no mind to harming others, or view power as a sign of superiority above other people. But for the religious individual, power is dangerous for an additional reason. Power and its attendant advantages is liable to distract religious people from the tradition to which they have cleaved before gaining power. It can lead to ignorance, and ignorance is the enemy of tradition. maybe one more paragraph. We are commanded to remember. We read in Deuteronomy 4:9 that the Holy Blessed One warns the children of Israel immediately before they enter the land. Take utmost care and take very great care of yourselves, lest you forget the things which you saw with your own eyes, and lest they fade from your minds as long as you live. Make them known to your children and your children's children. Take care, lest you forget the covenant that the Lord your God made with you. Make no sculpted image of any likeness against which God has commanded you. Forgetting God, ignoring our past, leads one to be enslaved to idolatry. Should I continue?
Up to you.
Yeah, well, it's connected to the last one, so yeah. Okay. So my grandfather arrived in the state of Israel in 1949, one of the surviving remnant, a small minority of Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust and came to Israel, mostly from refugee camps. The letter quoted above was written 3 weeks after he arrived in Israel, full of hope for a new religious life. And the book really is about trying to reconcile between his hopes and what's happening maybe now on the ground regarding religious ethics.
So it's been a really horrible 9 months. Tell us a little bit about what things are like at the moment in Israel.
Terrible. It's also been a really rough weekend. It's rough to the point that I was trying to understand how many soldiers were killed over the weekend, and it's really hard to follow because there were 8 who were killed in one instance, and then another 2 in another, and then 1 who died from his wounds from a battle a couple of weeks ago. So there is quite a bit of a frustration and depression. I have been flying back and forth over the last year. My family was in Boston since the end of September, actually. My wife was doing a postdoc at Harvard in Yiddish, and we found ourselves there. And the movement back and forth, as I'm sure a lot of you can relate, is very complicated. I wouldn't say necessarily hopelessness, but a feeling of sort of depression, in the sense that new problems are constantly created, and there's a feeling that the previous problems aren't solved or maybe even exacerbated. And while we might get into sort of hope and things like that later on in the conversation, I do think it's important to look at the issue as it is. I will also say on a personal level, communal level, I pray in a synagogue in Jerusalem called Hakel. We have a hostage from our synagogue, Hirsch Goldberg, Poland. Some of you might have heard his really incredible mother, Rachel, is a friend, speak over the last couple of months. So it's a very, very real sort of experience for a lot of us. And yeah, I think there is sort of just a very, it's just a very dark time. And I think we need to look at that. Maybe lastly, I will say into that as sort of somebody who identifies as Orthodox and somebody who comes from that community, it's also a very frustrating time regarding how religious leadership is speaking in the country, particularly the religious Zionist leadership, but not only. And in many senses, and this is a lot of what the book is about, I'm part of that community. So there's a deep frustration about, I don't like when people say this isn't a right or left issue, because it usually is. But there is I would say a sort of a very militant aggression and coarseness which has developed in the religious community, which is just very, very troubling. It's troubling for me as an Israeli, as a religious person, as an activist, but also as a parent who sent his kids to religious Zionist education. So there's sort of this aggression which and violence, which religious Zionism has come to symbolize, which is something that we're also dealing with. So yeah.
And your book, I mean, you wrote the book 3 years ago, and it came out in English in November last year. Has obviously, you write about all the themes that come up in the book, have been sort of have come up over the last 9 months. The relationship, what the Israeli state does with power, the justification of all those things. Do you, since writing the book, do you feel like what's happened over the past 9 months, has it sort of reinforced what you thought already? Has it changed anything in your view?
Kind of. I mean, it's really hard to think 3 years. I mean, 3 years ago, Ben Gvir was still not in Knesset, I think. So,
tell anyone who
our Minister of Police, who's also a Kahanist, I know him from like our Breaking the Silence days where he would attack us with eggs, and now he's the chief of police, or Minister of Police. So it's actually much more challenging. So the themes, in a way, the book is sort of like deals with all these things which came about during that time and more extremely in the last couple of years. But the book is definitely there, and the book was written exactly from that perspective. And there were two things, and as I feel is important to say, sort of in I guess in an NIF space, or two things that I was focused on. I've been very privileged to be part of like an anti-occupation world for the last couple of decades, and the religious element of my work was not something that I ever felt that I need to discuss in the past. A lot of Breaking the Silence people come from religious backgrounds, so it's something that we always felt that was sort of communal. But whenever somebody would ask me, I would say that's it's my own issue, or it's a communal matter, but it's not necessarily something that I need to discuss. And as on one hand, religious Zionist leadership became so focused on ethnic supremacy as its core sort of political value on one hand, and on the other hand, a lot of times my left community became much more insular and much more fearful of not only the religious right, but of religion in general. The book was really for an attempt for me to try to explain to myself and perhaps to others, where do I stand if in both communities I feel marginal or marginalized. So the book was really an attempt to try to explain, wait a minute, what does it mean to be halachic individual or religious individual or spiritual? All these words are terrible. Faithful individual, I don't know. So the book was really an attempt to deal with that, and in many senses, it still is. Yeah.
You just kind of touched on how kind of rare you are in sort of the anti-occupation left in Israel, being a kind of a religious, an Orthodox Jew. You talked about a little bit about breaking the silence. Could you just in the book, and I know you've spoken about this a lot in the past as well, but you had a kind of an experience as a soldier which sort of opened your eyes about the occupation and Israeli rule over the Palestinians. You don't have to tell us this.
That's okay.
But could you just explain what it is that moment taught you about what was happening?
Sure. I will though sort of like footnote what you said about sort of the rare, the rareness, I don't know, of the idea of being a religious left-wing individual. I think that's. I was just talking about this with a friend before we started, that the group that thinks that religious left exists least are religious lefties. Like, no matter what we do, we'll always look at ourselves as sort of a non-existent community. So we might get back into this later. Like in the faithful left, we had our second conference a couple of months ago that had 1,000 people. It was one of the largest left conferences in Israel, period, since the 7th of October, and we still think that we're like a non-existent group. Regarding my experience, I've been very fortunate. My parents are both very religiously committed and very much on the left. So I never felt that I was rebelling against my parents. In my political work, I did in the army. I served as an officer in the Second Intifada, which is weird to talk about, I guess, today in light of this current war. I just felt I felt a gap between how I was raised to behave and how I behaved as a soldier. I come from a religious upbringing in which the idea of sort of like humility, empathy, kindness, maybe being a bit hunched over, what gets annoyingly called today diasporic. I come from an education which is really proud of that, and if there's anything which is the opposite of that, it's being a soldier, period. And if there's anything which is even more than that, it's being a soldier whose work is policing civilians. So that frustration and the question of how am I perceived also by Palestinians, and am I perceived as somebody that I should be embarrassed of, this idea, which I was very much raised in the light of like Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem, like how do people view you when you're wearing a kippah? I think it's something that any like religious individual in any religion, you're constantly, I think you should be conscious of being a representative of a tradition, and that in a section which opens the book, sort of that's part of my attempt to understand: is it even possible to access let's call it pre-1948 religious ethics in a context where we have much more power? So, and I think that's a real question, and it should be a question for any traditional individual. And it's not only an Israeli question. It should be most Jews around the world have far more power, rights, and privileges than they did in the past. And then the question: how does one access the type of ethics which one, I think, should access, and maybe I'll say, and I think that the ethics that God wants us to access. How does one do that in light of being just in a different positionality?
You say something really kind of intriguing in the book. You say that there's this idea that religion is somehow kind of destroying Israel. It's a bad force in Israel. Yeah. And it's bad for the liberal democracy of the quality that Israel in theory could be. But you say that it's the opposite, that secular nationalist Zionism has corrupted religion, and the problem is that way around. Can you just...
Yeah, well, even if not, maybe not necessarily the opposite, but definitely complementary. I think that we make these sort of clean distinctions between secular liberal Zionism, which is supposedly non-theological at all, and sort of this corrosive sort of religious outside force, which brings its sort of dark, anti-Western and anti-liberal ideas and sort of, is taking over. And I think, and many times, there's an element of truth to that. The groups which are most aggressive, violent in the country right now are sadly groups of religious men. But I don't think they're behaving contrary to, let's call it secular Zionist values, but maybe doing types of secular Zionist values very religiously. I think the idea that secular Zionism has no theological element that doesn't really work, and I focus on a lot on that book, and these aren't ideas which are new to me, nor most of these ideas in the book, But the whole idea of returning to the land after 2,000 years, the questions of Jewish of Jewish superiority, questions of Jewish demography, questions of Holy Land, questions of our, sacrifice, all of those words and all of those meanings have such weight to them that to sort of make this clean break between some sort of, sterile, liberal, non-theological, secular element, I think is not sort of assessing both sides. And within the religious element, I think there's basically there has been for a very long time in Israel this sort of quid pro quo that secular Zionists these are all very wide terms and superficial, so sorry. But let's say many times sort of secular Zionist elites will grant religious Zionists, will allow religious Zionists to be like the kosher certificate of actions. And then what religious Zionists get out of that is a seat at the table of leadership. So there's this back and forth between both communities, which is detrimental to both communities. We know this a lot in the context of Jewish and democratic, right? So Jewish and democratic is not a religious Zionist term, it's a secular Zionist term mostly, and probably a liberal term. But the function that Jewish plays in the phrase Jewish and democratic is always to allow what democracy doesn't allow. That's the only function that Jewish serves in Jewish democratic. We're democratic, but we're Jewish, so we're allowed to do A, B, C. Nobody ever says, we're democratic, so we're allowed to do A, B, C, but we're also Jewish, so we can't do that. And when one can say that, one can definitely say that even in the war. There are things which are legitimate by different versions of, let's say, international law, but things which I think a fair assessment of Jewish tradition and Jewish ethical values would say we're not allowed to do it, even if international law mandates that we are. But that's not the function that it serves. So I think that's not a religious Zionist problem. That's a fundamental challenge of the state. I remember once I had a conversation, maybe we'll end with that, with a friend of mine who is a very secular individual, and again, words I know. And I said to him, let's say we had this situation in Israel where there were 50-50. There were 50% Jews and 50% non-Jews in the country. And in this theoretical challenge, there are two airplanes with immigrants who want to become citizens. One is a group of Neturei Karta, ultra-Orthodox Jews, and one is a group of Druze potential soldiers. Which plane would you choose? And he thought about it way too long, and he also chose the Neturei Karta people. And I think that's a challenge of the state. It's not a challenge of religious Zionism. So even though the book, because I live within that world, and I'm engaged with that theology, the book is primarily about that. It's very important for me to sort of not make this sort of an internal religious issue in which, secular people are standing on the sidelines. This is actually a fundamental challenge of the state.
We're going to go to audience questions very soon, so please save your questions up. But I want to ask you one question that's a bit maybe more hopeful before we move to the next question, if that's okay. So obviously you've been, you mentioned Small and Munim, the conference, the Faithful Left, so you've had two conferences, and it's a sort of alternative to the move to the right of mainstream religious Zionism. Tell us a little bit about that and how you're sort of connecting with different groups of Jews in other parts of the world as well.
Sure. And I do want to say a couple of words about hope as well, because I think that's sort of important, and especially because I'm rethinking the tone of the last 20 minutes. Well, first I'll say that sort of the Faithful Left, or Small Emuni in Hebrew, started a year and a half ago, so very, very recently. It started the day after the elections. A whole bunch of us, actually through the organization which I run, which is called the Alliance Fellowship Program, which is half Jewish and half Arab. There are a lot of religious people on the Jewish side, and we've become very friendly as activists together, and the day after the elections, we spoke with each other and said we need to do something. A lot of it was that we were really feeling alone. And there's this, if you read like Haaretz newspaper, it was sort of like the enemies are at the gates, and like what'll happen when the White Walkers enter, and we all become religified or whatever. But for us, this is when Netanyahu made the coalition. For us as religious Jews, we're already dealing with a problem which is inside of our community. We had this conference, and then the joke was, oh, who's going to come? All 5 of you. And 700 people showed up, and suddenly there was, and particularly young people. We use the word faithful and not religious for a lot of reasons, but I will say in the demographic context, because a lot of our leadership is Haredi, particularly like Haredi women and feminist organizations, all organizations, sponsored and promoted by the New Israel Fund, and we ran this conference with a request from the New Israel Fund, and then we realized that there was a need for this kind of thing to happen. And we started doing weekly events, be they more sort of like religious learning or activism, particularly in areas like Hebron, but also in other areas as well. We had a second conference in February this year, and we were really worried in light of the war what would happen. And as I said, 1,000 people showed up, so it's even larger than the first. We did it in the Great Synagogue in Jerusalem, also kind of as a joke, but also as like a reclaiming. What's been really interesting is that a whole bunch of groups have been forming around the world. There's this group called Halachic Left, which is in the US, but also in the UK, starting recently, which is growing. And there are groups which are maybe a bit more to the left and a bit more to the center, which is great, and really trying to have a conversation with each other. I don't think this is only an Orthodox phenomenon. I think as religious hegemony has become so grotesque in Israel, there are a lot of people who are frustrated by the fact that their tradition is so far, how they imagine their grandparents is like the opposite of how they imagine religious leadership now. And while sort of the backbone of all these religious left movements is coming from the Orthodox world, I find that there's a lot of conversation with people who are outside of that world who are just looking for a model that they can say this aligns with our values in a more meaningful way, and that's been really exciting for me. There's actually a really interesting phenomenon. It's actually happening all around the Jewish world for different reasons since the 7th of October, which is people are moving more to religion. And you see that in polling data around the world, and some are doing that as a move to the left, and some are doing that as a move to the right. Like that's, I think, the diaspora Israel split. But it's still happening, and then I think there's a lot of work to be done in that front. I am not, we were talking about that before, I'm a very happy person. That doesn't mean I'm optimistic. Those are two very different things. But optimistic, and I'm not very, I don't wake up most days optimistic, but I am very hopeful, which I also think is a third thing, which is that, first it is important for me to say, I don't know how many of you have been in Israel since the 7th of October. Going to protests either in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, which have been happening every Saturday night, and not only since like 2 months after the war started, is one of the most, for me, emotional and motivating experiences. We tend to forget that what's happening now is not the people, it's the government. And there are so many just incredibly inspiring people out there, some of which are going through literal hell right now, like the hostage families, who are just not only incredibly inspiring, but incredibly humanistic. I'm thinking of Rachel Goldberg-Polin, but not only her, so many of the family leadership and leadership of people, and leadership which has been emerging of people whose closest relatives have been killed or murdered in the 7th of October and the following. Just so much inspiration. If anything, I think from the 7th of October, I didn't see any way out. After the 7th of October, while still most days are dark, you see an option out of this. And it has to do with the recognition of the fact that there are just incredible people in the country. It's such a moving experience. For me, I just want to get back to they're so heavy and sometimes just so rough, but you look around, definitely I know in Jerusalem, and maybe I'll say with that, like all sorts of like these small pockets, and Hirsch's friends are all like they're part of a soccer club, football club, in Poal Yerushalayim, and they'll come, tens of them, every Saturday night, and not only with their anarchist flags, which have nothing to do with anarchism, it just has to do with the football team, and they'll just be so there and impressively there. And you look at the amount of young people at these protests who are 18 or 19, or even young people who are serving, and you say there's real hope for this place. And a lot of, I think, the role of activists and the role of leadership is to constantly look for those groups and for those people who are out there and are looking for opportunity to do things. And I do find a lot of hope there. Definitely in these very, very depressing times.
One final question before we go to the audience, but one of the most prominent sort of religious Zionist leaders in Israel at the moment, but Bezalel Smotrich, has been very outspoken about how little he wants to risk for things for the life of the hostages. Made it very clear that he sort of. I wondered whether you think that the way that he and other people in his part of the spectrum have spoken about hostage lives has sort of made people slightly start to question the kind of the religious right and the kind of justifications for that sort of position.
So I think it goes both ways. I think there's definitely a growing anger at religious right leadership. At this point, I think it's clear that they're the dominant force, which is the reason we're in a war right now. I mean, even if I was to say this a couple of weeks ago, I would still be deemed as sort of like a lefty. But at this point, like Gantz and Eisenkot are saying that that the reason we're still fighting is because of Smotrich and Ben Gvir and that sort of group. But it also goes the other way around. My oldest daughter is very, very active. She's 16. She's very active in the hostage protest, and she goes to a religious day school, religious girls' school. And she's kind of embarrassed to talk about the fact that she's protesting for the hostages within the context of her school, because it's become so clear in a religious right environment that we're not supposed to be for hostages, that it makes her sort of an outcast. I'm saying these words out loud and they're insane. If anybody knows sort of even like a rudimentary religious understanding of how our tradition treats hostages and hostage negotiations specifically, and I'm not only talking about like 1,800 years ago, or Maimonides saying, or it's the most important mitzvah, or like the Shulchan Aruch saying it's anybody who doesn't do it is like a murderer. I'm talking about like Rav Ovadia Yosef like 20 years ago saying this is probably the most important thing. So there's this incredible break from tradition on the ethical front, which is the problem with not putting a voice against that is how immediate these things can become a dominant and hegemonic ideology. And in that sense, I think like these various religious left programs, which are and movements and groups which are organizing, we don't need to be the majority. We need to just be there, and we need to be there effectively and with the knowledge base that needs to happen in order to put up that other option. Any protest you go to now, in Israel, you'll see a sign that says, many signs that say, En mitzvah rabba kmo pidyon shvuim, or there's no greater mitzvah than pidyon shvuim, which is a quote from, in that version, a quote from Maimonides, and we're putting out those signs, not at this point, not only us, but that sentence is really, really important. You know, that sentence is really important to be out there. That people, apropos what I read at the beginning, people can really forget our tradition. And I think that a lot of that is what's happening now.
Thank you so much, Mikhael.
Sure.
We're now going to go to questions from the audience.
You've got a religious background, so I'm wondering whether you believe the biblical prophecies, and if so, what might be coming next?
Which ones?
Zechariah, Ezekiel, but yeah, it's quite a few, yeah.
Okay.
Should we take another question and then...
Sure.
Could I start by saying how much I appreciated your talk, and in the spirit of grounding your views in your own biography, sorry this is going to be quite long-winded, I would like your comments on how I behaved in certain situations in the light of my background. I was born in February 1945 to an English-born father and a refugee from the Nazis who came to England in 1939. In the mid-1980s, I was working for a national charity in quite a senior position, and they decided to start on anti-racism as a central part of their identity. And I was among the first few to pilot a group who wanted to offer anti-racism training. Early on in this training, we were asked in an exercise to say what our greatest fears would be if black people had power. And I took this as a serious question, and I answered, my greatest fear is that they would behave like the Jews have in Israel. That is to say, that having been oppressed, once they get power, they behave like the oppressor. The answer I got from the trainers to this was, don't be so stupid, of course we wouldn't. And I said, I took your question seriously, I answered your question seriously. The second thing I wanted to tell you about happened more recently, after the 7th of October. I moved a few years ago for the first time, to live in a predominantly Jewish area. I previously actually avoided living in a very Jewish area. And I was invited by neighbours to a tea party for new residents. We were all Jewish. Not surprisingly, the conversation turned to Israel and Gaza. And one of the people there said, after all, our entitlement goes back 2,000 years. The Palestinians came later. And I said, excuse me, on that argument, what are we all doing in the UK? Why should we be thrown out?
Yeah, I think I can actually connect the second question to or comment to the question that was asked before. Before sort of saying semi-jokingly that, I don't think Orthodox Jews do Bible usually. I was told in yeshiva that it's a book for secular people. And that we read Bible through the Mishnah. In a more serious note, though, I would say, and a lot of the book is about sort of the interpretation of biblical prophecy in our context. This is always sort of a weird thing for me. You know, if you ask a religious Jew, like, please explain to me what God's hand looks like. So they'll say, that's absurd, you know, you can't imagine sort of like the hand of God. But if you ask like what redemption looks like now to a religious Zionist, they'll say, oh, it's a parliamentary democracy in the 21st century, which works. The taking of biblical prophecy and turning it into the temporal sort of nation-state format seems to me hyper problematic. and not in line with so much of our tradition. More importantly, I would argue that, in Israel, you say the swear word thrown at the right is that they're messianic. Yamina Mashiachia, that you always hear that they're messianic. Like, it's enough to say the word messianic that it's considered sort of a problem. A, I'm messianic, and B, I don't think religious Zionism is messianic at all. If you look at religious Zionism in the 60s and 70s, it was very messianic. They were sure that the Messiah is around the corner. And soon there will be, it was actually very optimistic, it could be very problematic politically, but it was very optimistic, and I would even argue universalistic ideology, the one of the, Rav Kook, the father, and also the son. I don't hear almost anything about the Messiah being around the corner in this Gaza war. You don't hear about that at all. And it's also a very dark worldview regarding humanity in general. It's actually much more focused on the present than it is on the future. And everything has to do with worldly politics, and nothing has to do with God. So there's something very hyper-secular about religious Zionist, current religious Zionist theology. And in that sense, I think that the messianism is missing. Because the messianism allows for something which is not done by you, but rather done by the divine. And I think that's, religious Zionism has replaced this dialogue with God with a monologue that they're telling God what to do. And that, for me, is sacrilege. And I'm trying to be cautious with my words. So we'll just say sacrilege. But there is an element of idolatry there when you replace God with yourself. So regarding biblical prophecies and regarding the questions later about, I've actually become much more tribal since the 7th of October. In the sense that I really am constantly filled with love towards my people. And to the place where I live. I've been reading a lot in recent months about sort of where did this idea of kissing the land come from. People don't do it anymore. I think because you land now in Netbag and it takes like a half an hour till you see land, like Earth. You're just walking on these like. This notion of like this idea of like love towards land is something which is sort of relevant to my life, and it's a very old idea. It's a very old notion, and I think one which is actually pretty extraordinary. I don't know of many faiths who do that with land. We know it, I think, from like Abba Min Akko. I think it's like third generation like Talmud in like Akko, which I'm not even sure is considered land of Israel. But this notion of kissing the land. But I think for me, the opposite of kissing the land and the opposite of loving the land is the erasure of land and the erasure of the history of it. And for me, the erasure of the history of it is also the erasure of the Palestinian history of it. And if I want to love Israel really, I need to love everything that developed on it. And part of what developed on it, or a lot part of what developed on it, is non-Jewish. And the erasure of Gaza for me is the erasure of the land of Israel. And the erasure of the land of Israel is the erasure of God. And so for me, I'm trying to take that very seriously. I don't want to run away from the physical. Like the physical love of our people and the physical love of our land is not something that I want to shy away from. But I think loving it really is loving. There's this really frustrating notion that people constantly present of the universal being the opposite of the particular. But I don't think that's how love works. If you love particularly, really, it develops onwards to the universal. So if I care about, and it was definitely true around Gaza, is that this notion that if you care about Gazans, you're less loyal to your people. And that's awful, you know, and that's a terrible, terrible notion. And my feeling is that the more I care about my people, the more I'll care about Gazans. And in many senses, the hostage crisis is maybe the most extreme version of that. Because in order to save our people, we need to save Gazans as well. So for me, regarding the connection of power and regarding the connection of prophecy, I think around this current war, that's where my mind has been going.
We maybe have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation. I actually have a question related to the Mishnah. In Mishnah Sanhedrin, I think chapter 4, there's a pasuk that says, if you save one life, it's as if you saved all lives, and if you destroy life, it's as if you destroyed all lives. But in Hebrew, it says, Mi Yisrael. Yisrael meaning a Jewish person. So I think when our religious texts kind of give way to the ways of like Ben Gvir and people who are really committing atrocities, and they can justify it with our texts, how do we reconcile that with our religion, and also to, you know, like help us see that what they're doing is wrong and still be a religious person at the end of the day?
Sure. Yeah. Are we going to do both questions? I can answer that one in the meantime. First of all, the Wissenschaft in me will tell you that that's actually, there's a change in that Mishnah. And if you look at the early versions of it actually doesn't say Yisrael. It's Kol HaMatzil Nefesh Achat. And the word Israel is probably added recently. And there's a great article that came out a couple of months ago by David Rosenthal and sort of his book. So just mention that. But if we don't have, sorry, I had to. But if we don't have that, we will be able to find other, right? We'll be able to find other sources which are either which are not fond of Gentiles. Right? We have a whole bunch of those, and then the question is how one reads those texts. So just briefly, I'll say, because I do try to deal with that in the book, although I think there's a lot of ways to deal with this question. Is I was taught by my dad to remember the historical position of when these texts are written and how they're written. So it makes sense that in a situation of a marginalized minority, there will be a lot of animosity towards the majority and a lot of fantasies of revenge. And then the question is, or just general hatred. And then the question is, how do we deal with that? And one can decontextualize that and dehistoricize that and live out those fantasies of revenge. And one can say, we must listen to fantasies of the marginalized in the context of their marginalization. And I think both of those are legitimate. There's not one authentic reading of the text. It's just a question. Ultimately, I think there really is like a faith-based question in the sense, like, how do we think God wants us to read these texts? And that's how I think God wants us to read these texts. So I don't think there's any way around that. I don't think that my interpretation of text is more authentic than Ben Gvir's. I just think he's a bad person. And I think God wants us to be good people. And I don't think he's a bad person only because of, only because the text tells him to think otherwise. I was raised to think that he's a bad person. And I'm fine with that. But it does mean that we need to take our sources seriously and deal seriously with those sources which are more problematic. But I think we actually do that much more with other texts. We know how to do that due to a lot of great work by serious people. We know how to do that much better on gender now. But we don't know how to do that on Jewish Arab questions as much as we should, and I think that should be a forefront of work like the Halachic Left in the UK is doing, is to open up those spaces which haven't been open for a lot of political reasons. So I don't think it's hiding away from the more problematic text. but recognizing in what places they were written in history. And maybe lastly, because this is sort of something important to me, reminding ourselves that there are an incredible amount of texts about loving all humanity, which are very, very central to our tradition. There's this notion now in religious Zionism that all texts which are humanistic are Christian ethics. But if you read any like Kabbalist of Tzfat, it's hyper like universalistic in the context of definitely in the context of love. So yeah, just reminding ourselves that that's there as well.
Well, this is your last question then, I think.
I even know what the last question will be then, if that's it's a different question. Oh, but it's okay, yeah. Sure, yeah.
My question is, given that what we hear coming from the Palestinian community about religious thought is very maximalist in its, in its thinking, have you established working relationships with Palestinian religious voices that seek to find a common understanding and a way towards peace?
So most of my working life is with Palestinians and not with Jews. This is actually a weird conversation for me in the context that most of what I do in my day-to-day is running a political fellowship program which is half Jewish and half Palestinian citizens of Israel. And it's traditional.
Religious.
So just to say something about that religious element, my work primarily, I think Israeli left primarily work with Palestinians is not sort of, there are definitely sort of interfaith projects, and some of which I'm part of and I really, really believe in, and also there's just a lot of incredible inspiration from Muslim sources. I think it's really hard to understand Jewish texts in the Middle Ages without understanding Muslim sources. So one needs to take Muslim sources seriously, otherwise we don't understand our own texts. And definitely in terms of the type of texts that I've been sort of throwing out in the last couple of minutes. My work as an Israeli, I think, is mainly is not a focus on that type of relationship building, but rather on actually inwards looking at the places where we have privilege which we shouldn't have, and power which we shouldn't have, and focus on how to do that very odd thing of getting rid of what you have but you don't need. So that's my primary work, and I try to, and it's easier. That's how I think about politics. So it's hard for me to sort of switch into the conversational when sort of the positionality is so unequal. And that's not to negate projects which are more conversational or more sort of interfaith. It's very hard for me as an individual to look beyond the lack of equality. And it's not a good answer to your question, but it's an honest answer. I do want to say, though, since we're sort of wrapping up in terms of what I understand, so I just want to say one thing that's important for me to say as an Israeli, and because we were talking about this before, and it's really important for me to pass this message on, because I was in the U.S. this year, and there was so much frustration of lefties, Jewish lefties, towards Israel, and I want to leave you with this thought that Israelis, including your allies right now, are in a ditch. And they can't see out of the ditch. It's not because they're less ethical than you are. It's just that they're in a ditch. And yelling at them that they can't see outside of the ditch is not understanding that they're in a ditch. But helping them out of the ditch could actually be really, really important. So trying to focus less on the ethical judgment and trying to think more on where to assess that the hopefulness, the hopefulness or the optimism, and sort of focus on that in order to create a more immediate sort of end of war, return of hostages, focus back on democracy, and so on, I think is a much better use of sort of both Israeli time and also time around us. So I've been sort of keeping that in my head since the beginning, and it's really important for me to get out there. So thanks. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mikhael.
Sure.